Welcome to another episode of LoveTech Live. In this episode, we'll be covering JavaScript for loops. For loops in all programming languages are a very important concept that allow us to achieve repetition and have fine control over how many times the repetition occurs. We'll be covering a couple simple examples, including just a count from 1 to 10 and a nested example where we have two for loops, one within the other. We'll also be looking at the syntax of a for loop and the three clauses that make up the for loop's definition, as well as the closure, which defines what code is run repeatedly. So let's start with the simple example in the console. If you're not familiar with the Chrome console, it's a really powerful tool for JavaScript, CSS, figuring out what's wrong with your program. You can do memory snapshots, see if there's any memory leaks. We'll be getting into that in much greater depth in a later episode. But for now, let's just look at this console tab, which allows us to run JavaScript and see what happens. So let's paste this in. Basically what we're saying is start I, which is our counter variable, at 1. And as long as I is less than or equal to 10, do this. Simply print I to the console. This is the console. And after you're done printing it, increment I by 1. And then as long as it is less than or equal to 10, continue. So what happens is we get the numbers 1 through 10 printed out. Perfect. So let's look at the syntax of a for loop, because many of you have seen this way to count from 1 to a number or from 0 to a number, which allows you to run something a fixed number of times. But a for loop is actually really powerful and has a lot of flexibility in how you define the various clauses that make up the definition. So you'll always see three clauses in your for loop. The first clause is the initialization clause. The second is the continuation condition. And the third is the final expression. Then you'll see a closure, which is defined by an open curly brace code, and then is ended with a closed curly brace. The initialization clause is an expression which is oftentimes a declaration of a counter variable. In this simple example that we just ran, we're declaring the counter variable I and starting it off at 1. The continuation condition is an expression to be evaluated before each loop iteration, including the first loop iteration. So if I said in the second clause I is less than 0, it would not even run a single time because it's starting at 1, which is outside of the acceptable range. And the third and final clause is the final expression. So this is what happens at the end of the execution of the code defined in the closure. In our case above, we're just incrementing I by 1. The plus plus notation, if you've never seen it before, is simply the equivalent of saying I is equal to I plus 1. But it's a little bit easier to write. And this occurs before the next evaluation of the continuation condition. And usually, and in this case, it's used to update or increment the counter variable. Now that we've covered the syntax of a for loop, you should be able to do all sorts of interesting things. It's because you're not always going to want to run something X number of times. It's going to be dependent on what happens in the execution of your logic, oftentimes. All right, moving on to another important concept with for loops, nested for loops. So let's just do a simple example where we're going to want to print out the numbers 1 through 10, and for each of them we're going to have a subcount going from 1 to 3. And we'll just have, so it'll be 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, and so on. Notice it's very similar to our above example, except we have this new variable j in our secondary nested for loop. The reason why I use j is because if I had used I, we would have come into a conflict. I believe that would even be an infinite loop. We'll test that out in a second. You'll see down below the common pitfall. Never use the same variable for the inner nested for loop, or you will experience unexpected results, and oftentimes an infinite loop. Alright, so let's copy this and check it out in the console. Perfect. So we see 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 2.1, 2.2 to 2.3. So the last thing before we close out this episode is let's see what happens if we used I again. So this is wrong, but let's see what happens. So I'm pretty sure we've hit an infinite loop here. It's not really showing us, but this, yeah, see, we can keep scrolling up and up and up. So I'll kill this off. It's not what we want. I just wanted to point that out because usually, see, it's even hung up now. You don't want this to ever happen to your user because it's certainly bad for performance. So the main thing is with for loops that you'll usually see a counter variable, oftentimes called I, which is started at 0. You say I is less than 10 if you want it to run 10 times. And then you'll have an increment. But it's not. You shouldn't always use I, irregardless of the rest of your program, because if I is already being used somewhere else, as in this example where we have the larger loop using I and the inner loop using j, we don't want to reuse I. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of LoveTech Live. If this video was helpful, click that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Check out the description box of this video or just go to lovetech.io for more plugins and tutorials.